thank you so much for doing this on your birthday, no less. What have you made of, say, the last couple weeks here in Toronto?
Geez, could you get it any more broad than that?
It's crazy, right?
Where do I begin? I think, when you look at the last couple weeks, maybe not all that surprising. I don't know that any Leaf fan went into this playoff with any realistic high expectations that this would be the year that they'd break through and win the Stanley Cup. I think that's probably fair to say. That said, certainly showed at least some sign of fight, some pulse in getting to Game 7 before yet again the disappointment that comes through from this team time and time again, it feels like. And now as you begin to unpack all of that and what it means, I just think the easiest way to do it is to ask a real simple question. Are you helping our team win or not? And if the answer is no, then I think you've got to make critical changes to this team that would indicate we have a collection here of players now that are going to help us win. And I think we've seen a big enough, long enough sample size to be able to make those judgments accordingly.
So when you ask that question, if you ask yourself that question, what immediately comes to mind of a person or people that are not helping this team win?
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear and abundantly obvious to me that Mitch Marner falls into that category. I don't care what his points per game are like in the playoffs. He's not helping the Toronto Maple Leafs win when it matters most. He's helping them get there. Fantastic regular season player, has piled up points, like very few in the NHL over the last number of years. And he cares, but I think it's too far gone. I think when you see him play in the playoffs, everything about him changes. It's his body language changes. His sphincter tightens at Scotiabank Arena when it comes to the postseason, and that's no good. I don't know that you can work your way out or play your way out of that. Austin Matthews, he had a few games this series before getting hurt / ill that he made his mark on the series. William Nylander is the one guy I've never really questioned when it comes to playoff performance. And then you could say what you want about John Tavares and the contract, which we all know he's not playing at a level up to that right now, but he still contributed to and was part of a couple game winners in this series. So the Tavares situation is going to sort itself out. Matthews is re-signed. When you look at Nylander, he's re-signed for the foreseeable future. We've now got one player who is not just a square peg in a round hole, but has also arrived at a critical juncture this offseason where it's time to make a change. And so it kind of actually, in some ways, the picture becomes really clear to me. The question is, will the Toronto Maple Leafs act on it? Are they seeing it as clearly as everyone else is?
Can you outline the process behind the scenes? Let's say, there is momentum on something with the Marner camp sort of approach. Like, how do you think the next couple months would be handled from those parts? Will we hear anything public, do you think?
Yeah, I'm sure we'll begin to hear some things public if that's the path that the Leafs want to go down. But Nick, I've heard so much talk about no move clauses and how that might get in the way. I'm sorry, like maybe I'm ruthless, but I don't buy that for 1 second that that's going to be an issue here.
Because they're going to ask, and what is he going to do? Dig his heels in and say, no, I'm going to be here even though nobody wants me? Is that kind of what you're referring to?
It's even more simple than that, Rosie. What I would say is, let's put yourself and let's just say that it's handled more deftly than this, but for conversation's sake and for simplicity's sake, let's say the conversation goes something like this. Hey, Mitch, appreciate everything that you've done for our franchise the last number of years. However, at the end of next season, there is a 0.0% chance that we are re-signing you to a long-term extension. So therefore, your options are twofold. You can, one, dig your heels in and play out a contract year on a team that clearly doesn't want you here and a marketplace that has grown tired of you in an all-important contract year, by the way, or you can work with us to facilitate a move somewhere else, because at some point this Band-Aid's getting ripped off one way or the other, whether you like it or not. And I think you have to approach the conversation as bluntly as that if that's the path that you want to go down, because that's the way you have to handle this. It's not going to be easy. And you have a guy that expressed yesterday that he wants to stay in Toronto for the long term. And that's all well and good. But at the end of the day, performance is what matters. And performance, when it matters most, matters more than anything.
And for him to be in a contract year in his prime, he's going to sit down with his agent and say, here's the position we're in. What makes most sense for you to go out, have a good season, get to a place where you're happy, that's willing to pay you max dollar at the end of this season, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that if that's exactly the way the conversation goes, that any agent worth his salt is going to sit back and say, ooh, man, really tough situation that we're in here. Contract year. We need to have a good year, especially after the way these playoffs went. No one's going to say to their client, yeah, you know what? Tell them to bleep off and we're playing here next year no matter what. I can't imagine that that's the case. So there's been so much ink spilled, so much time spent already in the last 7 days talking about these no move clauses. I just gave you one example, and there's many ways to do it, of how to navigate around it.
And naturally, it's a big contract to move to. I know there's 1 year left, but you start thinking about fit. Like, how would it work behind the scenes too? Would a GM text another GM, text Treliving and say, hey, if you're open to this, we'd be willing to talk about Marner if he's open to it? Do you see a couple of examples out there of teams that could make sense? Like for me, Nashville's the one that always comes up.
Why Nashville?
Saros?
I mean, I guess. I don't know that you even need to go down the Saros path with Joe Wall being ready to go. And that 1 more year to really bargain contract. You're going to have to then pay Saros. So Nashville wouldn't be at the top of the list for me. I would look at, I don't know, let's say Utah. Team on the rise, team that has cap space and could afford the contract, team that clearly wants to make a splash. Team that has tons of picks and prospects to move, not to mention some healthy roster players that you could send back the other way. Like, I think a lot of people have also then begun to paint this situation as like, oh, well, because he had a bad playoffs means that Mitch Marner doesn't have value and the Leafs are going to have to, I've seen it both ways. Either the Leafs are getting an absolute haul for Mitch Marner, or that there's, teams out there that could be on the bargain hunt to see if they could get him at a low cost. I think the answer is probably going to be somewhere in the middle because of the contract, because of the commitment that would need to be made on the other end of it if you want to re-sign him. And that's really where his leverage would come in, is basically being able to indicate to a team, hey, I'm not going to be re-signing with you. That's what would kill a deal. And that's where he's got the ability to, stop it from even beginning to spin. So there's lots of, different avenues, but that's, at least right off the top of my head, that's one team that stands out.
So do you think a deal could get made without him being re-signed? Like, you think it would be like, oh, we announce Mitch Marner gets traded to Utah and he signed an XYZ extension, like that type of thing? Because you'd think a team would want that. Mitch would want that. Mitch doesn't want to go to Utah and then pack up and go to there. And then all
maybe,
of a sudden,
how do we know what Mitch wants? Maybe he wants to have a fantastic year and then have the entire deck open to him outside of Toronto.
Maybe obviously
what's the harm? I mean, he's already made a pile of money. He's secure for life. Why not just enjoy the ride from here on in? You've played for your hometown team. Hasn't worked out the way you envisioned it might all the time. And then what?
But players don't think that way. They don't think, I've made lots of money, I'm going to enjoy the ride. I mean, you might think that because it's all relative, but that guy wants to maximize every goddamn dollar he makes. He's looking at everybody above him and trying to get there.
Maybe that's part of the problem.
So let's keep in mind with Leafs Nation that, when a deal gets done, if it gets done, the return, you also have to factor in the fact that one of the assets of making a deal is opening up his cap space, which in turn, I know we're going to get something back for Mitch, but what you also get back is whoever you sign with that cap space, correct?
Yeah, and that's another really important thing that I'm glad you pointed out, is because so many people would look at a transaction like that and say, "Oh, can't believe that's, depending on what it is, can't believe that's all we got." There's a win in having cap flexibility if you are able to create some. And look, the Leafs are getting some anyway. You've got the TJ Brody contract coming off the books. Let's see what happens with Domi and Bertuzzi, although they both, certainly made their mark in the second half of the season. Let's see what happens with some of the other guys that, you could be making changes to your roster with. And also, let's see what kind of an impact, if you decide to make the coaching change, which I think we're all expecting to happen. What does the new coach and the aura that surrounds him, what does that have on the gravitational pull of what happens next? Whether it's his influence on the transactions that come next, or whether it's personal connections that he has. Like, there's a lot of, we haven't even seen the cards come out of the chute yet. That's how new this is. Then there's lots of opportunity to play them.
You talked about it. Is Sheldon Keefe done? And what are the chances, if he is done, that it's Craig Berube who's the new head coach?
I would say the likelihood is very strong that the Leafs make a coaching change. Now, when it comes to Craig Berube, I'm just not convinced that he's going to be on the market long enough to get to Toronto. I think he's on their list, or would be on their list of candidates, but I think he's, I guess the proper way to frame it would be, I think he's certainly very high on the New Jersey Devils list, and I'm not sold that he makes it to the end of this week, and that the Leafs may not even have begun their process yet, and he could be off the table.
Interesting. What about, we got a press conference coming up with management and ownership, and Sheldon Keefe's, Brendan Shanahan's involved in that, obviously. What do you think is going to happen with him? How much is he to blame? Is he going to be part of the process? And what do you read into the fact that they've already announced that he will be part of that press conference?
It's hard to really read into much in a press release. What I would say is the fact that he's planning to be there and have a seat at the table would seem to indicate that he's not going anywhere, which at least answers one of the questions that's sort of been lingering. New president of Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, Keefe Pelly, he comes in. What's his relationship like with Shanahan? What questions has he asked? I'm told that MLSE began to have meetings internally last week when the Leafs went down 3-1 in the series, to already start to begin asking questions. Maybe not much of a surprise there, but to me, the way I look at this offseason is just about everything needs to be on the table. I mean, we're approaching 10 years now of everything that's unfolded here. And just look at the division around you now. There's been all this talk about, oh man, the Bruins, I can't believe we run into the Bruins every year, or the Lightning, or whoever it might be. Well, like 10 years ago, the Florida Panthers were a laughing stock in their division. Why have the Panthers so far past you now? Why are they now considered one of the beasts of the East? And it's not just one team. I guess it's my point to show that I think there's been lots of, sort of stagnant water here when it comes to making changes. They've talked themselves into pretzels of, well, this isn't working, but, we might be a worse team if we make this trade and pry off a good player from our core. How much more evidence do you need? There's something broken with this team when it comes to the playoffs. Their high water mark, oddly enough, came against the Panthers last year, is 5 of the 16 wins required. In my opinion, the only question, we talked in the beginning about a simple way to evaluate this offseason. Does this player or person help you win? I can take it one step further. When you're evaluating the overall health of your team, are we an authentic threat to win the Stanley Cup? And I think universally, even the most diehard Leaf fan would say this year, not a threat to win. How does that change? How do you begin to go about answering the question of, yes, we are? And I think there's so many different facets to this. We could spend a billion hours talking about this, but the scariest part to me for the Toronto Maple Leafs when it comes to their playoff exit is that this is a defense core that is so wildly undermanned, and yet that is not the reason they did not make it out of the first round this year. The fact that they have this core and can't score is incredibly alarming. How do you rejig the wheel? How do you redo your cap table, so that you're not in the same position moving forward? Those are the questions to ask.
Isn't that the anomaly of this whole situation, is that they built a team to score a ton of goals, and everyone said, well, that's not how you win. But they said, too bad, we're going to be so good, we're going to do it anyway. They invested in these 4 guys, these superstars, and they were going to outscore their opponent. And everyone said, well, you don't have a goalie, you don't have good enough defense core. And then they go about their business, and every year they can't score any goals. Like, isn't that just mind-blowing?
It's not an anomaly. What that is a colossal failure. That's a failure on many levels, and it's not just a fluke.
But don't you think the way they would lose, if you didn't agree with that system, is they would, lose 6-5 and 5-4, and they would be a high output scoring machine, but not enough defense, yet they're losing 2-1
then it'd be easy to
game.
fix. I think then you turn around and you say, okay, well, we've got the scoring part figured out. Now we can fix our back end a little bit.
Right, but that's not where they're at. So isn't this an anomaly of going, what the hell do we do? Do we go get more offensive players, like, and do the Shanna plan again with different players and get a high octane offense to try to score?
I think you need a better balanced team overall. I think we've been saying that forever. Not only do you need to reinvent the defense core of this team, but you also need to reimagine what the forward group looks like. And it's not just core players. The Leafs bottom 6 has been lacking for years because they just don't have the wherewithal, cap flexibility wise, to be able to pull it off. And you can try and mine, the Michael Buntings, the pick the flavor of the season, the Zach Hymans, whoever it is. But at some point you can't afford to keep those guys, and they're gone. And so that becomes the nature of the reality, is you're constantly shuffling players in and out. And guess what? You're not going to find one of those guys every year. You're going to find one of those guys once every 5 years. And the whole puzzle begins to get really difficult to put together.
Yeah, and to me, it's a delusion, guys. Like, a lot of the guys on Locker Cleanout Day are like, we're close. Close to what exactly? I mean, winning a playoff. You're not close anywhere close to winning.
That's the saddest part of what I heard, not just from Locker Cleanout Day, Nick, but just even in the immediate aftermath of Game 7. We were so bleeping close, Willie Nylander said. Bleeping close to what? You say that when you lose in Game 7 of the Cup final. You say that when you lose in Game 7 maybe of the conference final. But 3 of the 16 wins required? Like, what are we talking about here? This is how low, impossibly low, the bar has been set for this franchise, which is just how happy was everyone to win one round, to then basically have shot your load last year when you get to the second, that you get your doors blown off by the Florida Panthers in round 2.
Yeah, I agree. They're nowhere close. A lot of people in the chat asking about Joel Quenneville. Is he a guy that's ever going to be reinstated?
Well, I think first off, when it comes to Joel Quenneville, what he deserves more than anything is a sentence. I don't know about you guys, but the way the justice system works here in the U.S. is you commit a crime, which, by the way, he didn't do, but just for, hypothetical and reasoning, you commit a crime, you get a sentence, and you know how long you go to jail, even if it's for life. But in this court, in the court of the commissioner of the NHL, Gary Bettman, you are suspended indefinitely, and you have no date of return. You have no date of hearing, in fact. You have no date when that question will even be answered. That's the most ridiculous part to me. If you want to say that Joel Quenneville is out of the league for life, it's a statement I wouldn't agree with, but at least he would have been given a sentence. And I don't know how that part is arguable. Maybe, you can argue about whether he should or shouldn't be back, whether, the 3 years that he's now sat out of the NHL, is that enough? We could debate that till you're blue in the face. that he deserves a sentence, to me, is inarguable. And I think at some point, with the work that he's done behind the scenes, with the work that Stan Bowman has done, this is a real conversation and question as we enter yet another hiring season that should be had, because, you know, the people who actually do commit crimes and go to jail, when they get out, they have a right to earn a living again. And these people haven't committed crimes and yet have not had a right to earn a living in the NHL. And some people would say, oh, but it's a privilege, not a right. I guess, but we're also talking about restricting someone's ability to earn a living.
Make sure to check out more of our content right here on the Leafs Nation YouTube page. We got long form interviews, we got clips, we got epic rants by Jay Rosehill. We simply have it all. And don't forget, you can find out much more at theleafsnation.com. Thanks so much for watching.